Hello class, welcome to this video on lesson 3.1, Introduction to Data Collection. So our learning goals for today are to distinguish statistical questions from other types of questions. We also want to identify the population and sample in a statistical study and distinguish between observational study and experiment. So we're going to describe the statistical problem-solving process. In general, this is sort of like the scientific method, where in the scientific method, you generally have some sort of hypothesis. So you want to make an observation, and then, formulate a hypothesis. And then you're going to collect data, set up your experiment in order to test a hypothesis, right? And then get to your ultimate conclusion. So, in the same way, statistical problem solving process starts by asking the questions, and there's valid questions and invalid questions, and we'll talk about what that means in this lesson. So the first step is to be able to ask the question. Then the next step is going to be basically starting to collect your data. So the second step is to be able to collect the data, design and carry out a plan to actually collect this data. The process of taking data from a population, right? So basically taking data from a subset of the population, that's known as sampling. Okay, so you have your general, you have your population, which is all of the subjects that you want to study, all of the individuals that you want to study, and then you want to take a subset of that population, right? So take a subset of this population and take samples. So for example, if I wanted to split this population into multiple groups, and then I can select from each group, right? It's maybe 5 people in each group. And so, this forms my sample, right? So how I take my samples from my population is essentially how I collect my data. And there's different ways to do that, and we'll talk about that in another lesson. The third step is to be able to analyze your data. So use graphs and numerical methods, computations to analyze. And then the final step is to interpret that data. So be able to interpret it and then see if how it answers the question, the statistical question that you're interested in. So we're going to focus on this first part, asking the question. So a valid statistical question is based on data that vary. So we'll talk about a couple of examples of how that looks like. So our first example, determine if each of the following is a valid statistical question. Justify your answer. So the first one is a question, but isn't valid, a statistical question. So how much money does Mr. Tagawa have in his wallet right now? So looking at that question, that's going to be a fixed value. Mr. Tagawa may have $5 in his wallet right now. And that's not going to change unless you're looking at a different point in time, right? But what we're looking at is right now, if I were to do that sample, I'm only going to have one data point that is constant. And that is not what we want for a valid statistical question. What we want is a set of data in which the data points vary. Okay, so there's some variance, and it's more than just one data point, right? So this is not a valid statistical question. Okay, so we're going to say that this guy is not valid because it can be answered with a single value that doesn't vary. Okay, looking at the second one, how long can students at your school hold their breath? So in this example, there's multiple data points, right? Multiple students, and the amount of time that they they hold their breath varies, right? So this is a valid statistical question, and you can use this for a study, right? So this is valid as the answer is based on data that vary. And so we can say that the length of time varies by student. All right, so the last question, do most US adults engage in vigorous exercise at least once a week? Similar to the previous question, this is going to be valid because it's based on data that vary. Some adults exercise vigorously and some do not. So this is going to be valid. As data can vary, similar to the second one. Going back real quick. Oops. Some adults, so exercise amount varies. Okay, so the next thing we're going to discuss is basically the population versus a sample. And that's really what we want to focus on in this next target, right? So what is a population, what is a sample, and how do you identify that in a given example, right? So a population, as we mentioned earlier, is the entire group of individuals, right? So so in this case, as I mentioned earlier, the population is everyone you want to study. So let's say this is my entire population, and then my sample is just a subset of that population. So let's say that's my sample. Okay, and then where I take my sample in my population varies, right? I could take a sample here, and then maybe next time around I could take a sample here, right? If I were to do the study again. So the idea is that we want a sample that is representative of the population. So we want this to be as representative as possible. Because we're only allowed to do the sample because we don't have enough money. We may not have enough money or time to be able to do every single person in the population. And so it's convenient to be able to take a sample. And whenever you take measurements on that sample, those are called statistics, right? So statistics come from samples. Like, for example, if I were to calculate the average from a sample, that's known as a statistic. If I were to calculate an average from a population, well, then that's known as a parameter. And so the idea of statistics is we want to use the sample and the statistics from the sample to be able to conclude what the population parameter could be, right? If we weren't able to do every single person in the population. So population is the entire group, and then the sample is a subset. Now, when you collect data from every individual in the population, that's known as a census, and that does happen. When you hear about the U.S. Census, that happens. Should be I believe it's every 6 months. So that'd be like maybe twice a year, if I'm not mistaken. But they try to collect data from a bunch of individuals in a region or population. So just something to keep in mind. So we just want to identify the population and sample. So the student government at a high school surveys 100 students at the school to get their opinions about a change to the bell schedule. So in this case, the population for part A, remember the population is the entirety of the group of individuals that we want to study. So we ideally want all the students in the school, right? But we're only able to survey 100. Okay, so the population are all the students in the school. And our sample is the set of 100 students, right? So we got the 100 students that were actually surveyed. All right, so let's take a look at the second one. The quality control manager at a bottling company selects 10 cans from the production line every hour to see if the volume of soda is within acceptable limits. Okay, so The population is the set of all cans coming from the production line every hour, and their sample is the 10 cans in that hour, right? So the population here is, all the cans from the production line every hour. For that given hour, there's a certain amount of cans. We want all the cans for that hour, right? And then the sample is, well, we just have the 10 cans, right? All right, so pretty straightforward, a population versus the sample here. So the next thing we want to look at is the difference between observational studies and experiments. So an observational study is basically how it sounds like. You're doing observations. So you're not in the observation study, you're not actively influencing the results. So you're only observing the subjects or the individuals in the study while not controlling the variables. So whereas in an experiment, you have variables that you want to measure, right? And you're able to fine tune, or you have a specific variable that you're interested in, and you're able to fine tune the experiment in order to allow for just an increase in the variable or tweaks in the variable in order to actually measure what you want to measure, right? Or make the conclusion that you want to make the conclusion for. So, for example, if you wanted to do a study on blood pressure, and you're looking at the amount of a drug, well, you can vary the amount of that drug in each group of individuals, right? You can fine tune that in an experiment. Whereas an observational study, you can't necessarily do that. So let's look at this question. Determine if each of the following settings describes observational study or an experiment. So 90 residents of a retirement community were selected at random. Each member was asked a number of questions, so sort of like a survey, including questions about exercise and high blood pressure. Residents who exercise more often were less likely to have a high blood pressure. So they found some results here. They said, okay, well, those who exercise more, there's a relationship between their exercise amount and their their blood pressure, right? Not having high blood pressure. So in this case, this is an observational study because you're not actually you're not actually imposing a treatment on the residents, right? So you're only asking them to collect the data. So you're only collecting the data by asking or observing. You're not actually imposing a treatment. Okay, so this is an observational study. As no treatment was imposed on the individuals in the study. Now, a treatment could be anything. It could be a drug treatment. It could be like in this example, if you wanted to set this up as an experiment, you can have the quote unquote treatment would be getting certain people to exercise a certain amount of time, and then having a control group in which nobody exercised, right? So having a group where nobody exercised versus people that exercised more often, right? So that would be like a treatment if you were to do it as an experiment. But this one's just an observational study. Now, the second one, students in a statistics class were divided into two groups at random. Students in one group were given a set of words to memorize in a room with music. So they had to memorize stuff, right? And so they had to memorize words and in a room with music. So, okay, so that's important here. And then students in another group were given the same list to memorize, but in a quiet room. So notice that we're adjusting the variables here, right? We're adjusting. They're saying, okay, we're going to put you in a room with music, and then the other students, we're going to put you in a quiet room. The students in the quiet room were able to memorize more words on average. So we're imposing a treatment. So this is an experiment. as we're imposing a treatment. Groups memorize the words with and without the music. So we're fine-tuning these variables, right? In a room with music versus one without. So just something to keep in mind whenever you're trying to decide. All right, guys, that's going to do it for the video. I hope you found this useful and informative. And as usual, I'll see you in the next one.